Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Over the last 3 years, we've produced hundreds of videos from our headquarters campus here in Edmond, Oklahoma, and from Jerusalem and surrounding areas in Israel. Most of the programs produced on campus here in Edmond have been presented from this stage in a college forum setting. Today, we've raised the curtain on this beautiful stage and have assembled a spacious set that will give us a lot more versatility when it comes to television production. So we're excited about this and about some of the productions that we hope to show you in the weeks and months ahead. As for today's program, we're going to focus in on one subject primarily. That's Benjamin Netanyahu's recent speech at the United Nations. We've had a lot to say about this speech on the Trumpet.com website and also at the Key of David television program. My father called the address the most powerful speech ever delivered at the United Nations. Benjamin Netanyahu is definitely sounding the alarm. The question is, will anyone listen?
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
But look, the point is that almost all authorities, if you ask them, believe Iran is about to develop the nuclear bomb. They're almost there already. And here is what terrifies many nations, even especially, I guess, in the Middle East, but not only there, is Iran is absolutely, totally the #1 terrorist sponsoring nation in the world. And they do that without nuclear weapons. What are they going to do with nuclear weapons?
That clip was from my father's Key of David program from this past weekend. So here you have the #1 state sponsor of terrorism, kidnapping and killing Americans and Jews, bombing U.S. and Israeli embassies and military positions all over the world. And they've been doing it for decades. And now they're about to get their hands on a nuclear bomb, and yet the United States government wants to put a freeze on sanctions and see if diplomacy can gain traction. Now at the UN, Netanyahu had a lot to say about Iran's recent attempt to soften its fiery rhetoric. Let's take a look.
President Rouhani, like the presidents who came before him, is a loyal servant of the regime. He was one of only 6 candidates the regime permitted to run for office. See, nearly 700 other candidates were rejected. So what made him acceptable? Well, Rouhani headed Iran's Supreme National Security Council from 1989 through 2003. During that time, Iran's henchmen gunned down opposition leaders in a Berlin restaurant. They murdered 85 people at the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires. They killed 19 American soldiers by blowing up the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia. Are we to believe that Rouhani, the national security advisor of Iran at the time, knew nothing about these attacks? Of course he did. Just as 30 years ago, Iran's security chiefs knew about the bombings in Beirut that killed 241 American Marines and 58 French paratroopers. Rouhani was also Iran's chief nuclear negotiator between 2003 and 2005. He masterminded the strategy which enabled Iran to advance its nuclear weapons program behind a smokescreen of diplomatic engagement and very soothing rhetoric. Now I know, Rouhani doesn't sound like Ahmadinejad, But when it comes to Iran's nuclear weapons program, the only difference between them is this. Ahmadinejad was a wolf in wolf's clothing. Rouhani is a wolf in sheep's clothing. A wolf who thinks he can pull the wool over the eyes of the international community. Well, like everyone else, I wish we could believe Rouhani's words. But we must focus on Iran's actions.
We have to focus on actions, as he said there. Jesus Christ said to judge by fruits, or actions, in other words. That's in Matthew 7 and verse 16. And yet look at how Western diplomats are so easily fooled by wolves dressed in sheep's clothing. Today happens to be the 34-year anniversary of Iran's takeover of the American embassy in Tehran back in 1979. And do you know what they're doing in Iran today? The Revolutionary Guard is sponsoring anti-American protests where they're singing Death to America chants, just like they did back in 1979. The slogan, Death to America, is the symbol of strength and determination of the Iranian nation against the dominance of the United States, which is an oppressive and untrustworthy nation. That's what it says on the official website of the Revolutionary Guard. Now, the Revolutionary Guard is the military wing of the regime that was founded right after the revolution back in 1979. Today it has 200,000 soldiers or so, and its number one goal is to protect Iran's Islamic system. It also, as you know, sponsors international terrorism, and its primary targets are the United States and Israel. And now, if recent reports are true, they're within months of perhaps acquiring nuclear weapons. Let me play another clip from Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech where he urges world leaders to learn from history, even recent history, from just a few years ago.
In 2005, North Korea agreed to a deal that was celebrated the world over by many well-meaning people. Here's what the New York Times editorial had to say about it. Quote, "For years now, foreign policy insiders have pointed to North Korea as the ultimate nightmare, a closed, hostile, and paranoid dictatorship with an aggressive nuclear weapons program. Very few could envision a successful outcome, and yet North Korea agreed in principle this week to dismantle its nuclear weapons program, return to the NPT, abide by the treaty's safeguards, and admit international inspectors. And finally, diplomacy, it seems, does work after all." Ladies and gentlemen, a year later, North Korea exploded its first nuclear weapons device. Yet, as dangerous as a nuclear-armed North Korea is, it pales in comparison to the danger of a nuclear-armed Iran. A nuclear-armed Iran would have a chokehold on the world's main energy supplies. It would trigger nuclear proliferation throughout the Middle East, turning the most unstable part of the planet into a nuclear tinderbox. And for the first time in history, it would make the specter of nuclear terrorism a clear and present danger. A nuclear-armed Iran in the Middle East wouldn't be another North Korea. It would be another 50 North Koreas. Now, I know that some in the international community think I'm exaggerating this threat. Sure, they know that Iran's regime leads these chants, death to America, death to Israel, that it pledges to wipe Israel off the map. But they think that this wild rhetoric is just bluster for domestic consumption. Have these people learned nothing from history? The last century has taught us that when a radical regime with global ambitions gets awesome power, sooner or later its appetite for aggression knows no bounds. That's the central lesson of the 20th century. And we cannot forget it.
This is a man who knows about this history. And you know what? So does Iran. Iran knows that if North Korea can get away with it, they can get away with it too. And that's exactly what's happening. Anytime an Israeli prime minister speaks at the United Nations, there's always a lot of UN officials and international diplomats who simply get up and walk out. You've probably seen footage of that before. And this year was no exception to that. In fact, this year it was worse. With the Jewish holidays arriving early, Netanyahu was forced to address the UN General Assembly as its final speaker long after heads of state, most of them, had already left New York. It was a sparse crowd sitting in on a speech that most people have already forgotten. Mr. Netanyahu concluded his speech by saying Bible prophecy is being fulfilled, and is it ever? Now, he's off on the timing of the specific prophecy that he cited in that speech, but still, for a world leader to stand up and speak about the fulfillment of Bible prophecy, that certainly is unusual. Now, my father discusses this subject at length in that latest Key of David episode, so make sure that you go back and watch that at thetrumpet.com.
To America's founding fathers, character meant everything to the success of the nation and its leadership. The Constitution was based upon the fundamental principles of religion and morality. These were the primary building blocks of the American nation. George Washington said, "The foundations of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality." Character was no minor issue to America's first president. He regarded it as the basis of national policy. Where did the Founding Fathers develop these ideas? Many of these principles stemmed from the Holy Scriptures. The Bible provided early Americans with the instruction and guidance of how to properly govern one's life. These beliefs helped build a nation of strong families and upright leaders. Today, America has dismissed the Bible as the foundation of developing righteous character. Men now leave it to themselves to determine right from wrong. Where has the rejection of biblically based principles led this nation? There is a cause for these effects. To understand the course of events that have led this nation to its current state, visit thetrumpet.com and click on the Literature tab to request our free booklet, Character in Crisis.
Today, our hope for the future is challenged by a nuclear-armed Iran that seeks our destruction. But I want you to know that wasn't always the case. Some 2,500 years ago, the great Persian king Cyrus ended the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people. He issued a famous edict in which he proclaimed the right of the Jews to return to the land of Israel and rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. That's a Persian decree. And thus began an historic friendship between the Jews and the Persians that lasted until modern times. But in 1979, a radical regime in Tehran tried to stamp out that friendship. As it was busy crushing the Iranian people's hope for democracy, it also led wild chants of death to the Jews.
That's some fascinating history there that Prime Minister Netanyahu brings to mind in his speech. Most people are unaware of the relationship that the Jews once had with the Persians and how close it was many, many centuries ago. I just want to go to a few scriptures here before we conclude today's program, which elaborates on some of that history that Netanyahu alluded to there. at the start of his speech. This is from Isaiah 44, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 44, and verse 26. It begins, "That confirms the word of his servant and performs the counsel of his messengers, that says to Jerusalem, you shall be inhabited, and to the cities of Judah you shall be built, and I will raise up the decayed places thereof." That says, speaking of God and all that God knows and prophesies. And it continues in verse 27, that says to the deep, "Be dry, and I will dry up your rivers." And that says, verse 28, "Of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, you shall be built, and to the temple, your foundation shall be laid." So here was a prophecy about Cyrus. God calls him here through his prophet the shepherd. He's God's shepherd. God used Cyrus anciently to open the way for the Jews to make their way back to Judea, to make their way back to Jerusalem so that they could build up the city, so that they could build the temple. This prophecy, by the way, was uttered almost 2 centuries before Cyrus even came on the scene. And then you can go to the book of Ezra, Ezra chapter 1, and see where when Cyrus gave this decree, then some of the Jews returned back to Jerusalem with all these vessels and so on to carry out God's will and to rebuild. But this Persian king was a critical part of this process. This open door really was opened by Cyrus. Just continue reading in the next chapter, verse 1. It says, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have holden, to subdue nations before him, and I will loose the loins of kings, to open before him the 2-leaved gates, and the gates shall not be shut." And so God refers to him as his shepherd, and here he says he's his anointed. And then he goes on and describes in great detail how God was going to make it possible for Cyrus to conquer many kingdoms, to bring down the most powerful kingdom at that time. The 2-leaved gates, it says here, would not be shut or locked. And so this talks about how the armies of Cyrus were able to get in and capture the city of Babylon and to bring down that Babylonian empire. Now let's look at Ezra. I mentioned that just a moment ago, the book of Ezra, where it talks about that decree. It also refers to it at the end of 2 Chronicles. But in Ezra 1, you pick up the story, verse 1, about how in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. It says, "The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying," and then you can go on and read the history there, but God used this man, as I said, to give the Jews the open door that they needed to go back during that restoration period. Now, if you go down to verse 5, it talks about the tremendous favor that Cyrus gave to these Jews returning back to Jerusalem, who no doubt needed to be encouraged and uplifted, who needed to be excited about the prospect of fulfilling God's will in Jerusalem. And read verse 5 where it says, "Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all them whose spirit God had raised, to go up to build the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. And all they that were about them strengthened their hands," it says, "with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, and with precious things, beside all that was willingly offered." And then notice what it says in verse 7, "And Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods." And so Cyrus not only gave them the opening that they needed to go back and to build, but he emptied out the treasury and gave these Jews the many vessels that had been stored away in Babylon since the Babylonian Empire had sacked Jerusalem before that. And so he unloaded all these vessels, gave them to the Jews, and they returned back to Jerusalem with a high hand, you could say, ready to build, ready to raise up the ruins, as we often talk about with respect to our work. Let's go back to Isaiah 45. I just want to read one more verse from that chapter, because as much as God gave Cyrus favor And of course, those Jews who were willing to stand up and act and work for God, in this chapter here, Isaiah 45, it's still speaking of Cyrus. God talks about what he's really aiming for in all of us, not just in Cyrus. We've read already how he spoke of him as a servant of God, a shepherd, his own anointed. But then notice what God says here in verse 5 of Isaiah 45. It says, I am the Lord, and there is none else. There is no God beside me. I girded you, though you have not known me. And so this was in many ways a carnal king, a Gentile king, who had his moments, his acts of brutality, of worldliness, whatever you want to call it. God used him. He showed kindness toward those Jews, as Prime Minister Netanyahu brought out in his speech. But in the end, what is it that God is really looking for in all of us? What does he want from all of us? He wants to really and truly know us. He wants to get to know you on a very personal level. Now, my father, also in that Key of David episode that played just this past weekend, he made a profound point there toward the middle of the show, where he talked about the level of belief that God seeks in us. He said people, well, they talk about the Bible, but they don't believe it. They talk about God, but they don't believe God the way Abraham did. They don't believe the Bible the way Abraham did. And look at the world we live in. Just look at this world. There's so much talk about religion. There's so much talk about God. And yet the world we live in is in so many ways a very unhappy place. A divided world. A world where nation is warring against nation, where families are upside down, if they're even intact, if they're even together. Let's conclude in Amos, the prophet Amos's book, Amos chapter 9. This was actually the passage that Mr. Netanyahu paraphrased at the end of his speech. And as I said, I mean, again, even if he was off on the timing of the prophecy, it's pretty remarkable to think about a world leader that stands up in the United Nations, right before the General Assembly, even if most of them were gone, and starts talking about prophecies that have been fulfilled. And that starts talking about the Bible in a positive manner. That's just very unusual today. You just don't see it. This is toward the end of Amos's prophecy. We have referred you to Amos 9, verses 11 and 12 often, just about this work and the work that God has been raising up since the death of Herbert W. Armstrong back in 1986. You can read more about that in Raising the Ruins and Malachi's Message, many other pieces of literature that we've produced. But following right on that prophecy there in verses 11 and 12, God projects ahead further to the world tomorrow, when His government, His family government, will be set up and established on this earth. And He gives us a preview of what life will be like on this earth during that time. Verse 13, Behold, the days come, says the Lord, that the plowman shall overtake the reaper and the treader of grapes, him that sows seed, and the mountains shall drop sweet wine, it says, and all the hills shall melt. And I will bring again the captivity of my people, of Israel, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards and drink the wine thereof. They shall also make gardens and eat the fruit of them. So there's going to be a rebuilding effort in the world tomorrow, but just prior to that, as is brought out here, there's going to be another captivity. And that's where this world is headed. That's where the modern day descendants of Israel are headed. But God does leave us with hope. He does leave us with hope. He does want us thinking about the time now just ahead of us, after the return of Jesus Christ, when there's going to be this massive rebuilding effort, a raising of the ruins worldwide. Verse 15 says, And I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled up out of their land, which I have given them, says the Lord your God. So this is talking about a time when God's family will be in place, headquartered in Jerusalem, It's the passage, as I said, that the Prime Minister referred to there at the end of his speech, and he's of course, off on the timing. He thinks that this is fulfilled today, and of course, it hasn't been fulfilled today. We're not living in the millennium yet. We're not now in the world tomorrow, but we soon will be. The prophecy is absolutely sure. People like Mr. Netanyahu might be off on the timing, but the prophecy is sure. And you can read all about that vision of tomorrow in Mr. Armstrong's wonderful book titled The Wonderful World Tomorrow. Along with that, all these things we've discussed here today, the recent Key of David episode, you can go and watch that at thetrumpet.com. And then, of course, make sure that you sign up for or request the Trumpet print edition as well, which comes out 10 times per year. That's all we have for you today. We thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on the Trumpet Daily.